Milani, and I'm the director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Feminine Culture, and this is one of those lectures that we co-host with the Salem Center for Policy at UT. We're very grateful for this collaboration, and I find it pretty interesting that this is the second lecture in a row where we're using literature to talk about broader themes. A couple of weeks ago, we had this talk on forgiveness and avoidance. They used the Anna Karenina novel to talk about forgiveness, which I think could be a theme also by looking at Dostoevsky and the brother Karamazov. But today again, yes, we have a talk where we will use a novel to talk more broadly about the human person. And in a way, I think it makes a lot of sense, because I think the one way we could think of philosophy is that it is a way to make sense of the individual story and of the global story, right? The collective story of people. So Dostoevsky's Brother Karamazov and the Truth of the Human Person is the title, and our speaker today is Dr. Scott Roniger. Dr. Roniger is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he currently holds the Father Robert H. Taylor Chair in Philosophy and directs the Roniger Center for Catholic Faith and Culture. He earned a baccalaureate in Sacred Theology, summa cum laude, and a Master of Sacred Theology, magna cum laude, from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. And even though I'm Italian, as everyone can tell from my accent, I promise I did not know him because of that. It's just a great place to study these kind of things. I don't want to take any more of your time, so I'll be welcoming Dr. Scott Roniger.
Afternoon, Mariana, and thank you to everyone involved with the Austin Institute, which I've learned a little bit about recently, and it's doing fantastic work, and I'm very honored to be asked to kind of make a small contribution to all the great things they're doing. So my talk today is going to unfold in 3 sections. The first section, I'm going to give some reflections on the way in which literature, in general, can help us to achieve something true about reality. And then the second part, I'm going to turn to Dostoevsky with an assist from Plato to give a very good, I think a very vivid example of the way in which a classic piece of literature can give us an insight into some deep truth, in this case about human nature and its connection to social life. And then a very, very brief conclusion, I'm going to draw out some connections between Dostoevsky and John Paul II. So that's the plan. So let's get started. In 1875, Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, began serial publication of a work entitled Old Times on the Mississippi for Atlantic Monthly magazine. These descriptions of his youthful training as a pilot on the Great River would later be included as the first part of his memoir, My Life on the Mississippi, which initially appeared in 1883. In Old Times, Twain recalls a formative practical lesson in river reading given to him when he was a mere cub, or that is, an apprentice, by his teacher and his mentor, Horace Bigsby. Mr. Bigsby, the seasoned and formidable pilot, commands the young Clemens to run over what he, Clemens, takes to be a bluff reef ahead in the water. A bluff reef would, in fact, destroy a ship. Fearful of the impending doom he anxiously anticipates from the reef, yet bound and faithful to the order from the pilot of the boat and the master of his education, Clemens grits his teeth and harmlessly runs over not a bluff reef, but a wind reef, which is a mere ripple on the surface of the water. Bigsby tells his apprentice that one day he too will develop an instinct for reading the river and distinguishing the 2 kinds of reefs. And he assures the young Twain, by and by, you will just naturally know one from the other, but you will never be able to explain why or how you know them apart. Twain says that, quote, the face of the water in time became a wonderful book, a book that was a dead language to the uneducated passenger, but which told its mind to me without reserve, delivering its most cherished secrets as clearly as if it uttered them with a voice. However, despite the thrill of learning this language and thus acquiring a rather useful view of the reality of the river, Twain admits that his hard-won practical competence at navigation came at a steep cost. Quote, I had lost something which could never be restored to me while I lived. All the grace, the beauty, the poetry had gone out of the majestic river. End quote. He then details an earlier experience of the beauty of a sunset on the majestic river as he drank it in at a time when he was still innocent of the art of navigation. And he laments that this experience of the beauty of the water was now forever relegated to the region of his memory. The price of his professional mastery was that, quote, the romance and the beauty were all gone from the river. All the value any feature of it had for me now was the amount of usefulness it could furnish towards compassing the safe piloting of a steamboat. Since those days, I have pitied doctors from my heart. What does the lovely flush in a beauty's cheek mean to a doctor but a break that ripples above some deadly disease? Does he ever see her beauty at all? Or doesn't he simply view her professionally and comment upon her unwholesome condition all to himself? And doesn't he sometimes wonder whether he has gained most or lost most by learning his trade? End quote. I wish to suggest that the two ways of looking at the great river distinguished by Twain open two sets of possibilities for disclosing its intelligibility. There are two stances we may take toward anything, and each stance has its own river current and directionality, each carrying us toward its own unique destinations. The active, practical, and professional look at the river enables one to acquire a useful domination of its contents. It strengthens us to master its contingencies so as to accomplish our purposes in navigating it, from war to commerce to tourism. By contrast, the contemplative look at the river, the glance of youthful innocence, carries us to a place where we can appreciate its beauty, romance, and poetry. The first culminates in Descartes' dream of making ourselves masters and possessors of nature, which is not without its practical benefits. But the second way of looking at the river reaches its apotheosis in philosophical and theological contemplation of the very being of things, as well as their relation to the whole of things and to the ultimate principle of the whole. Further, as Twain ruefully suggests, ought we not ask ourselves whether we, with all our sophisticated modern piloting and technology and navigation, have gained most or lost most by learning our trades so well? At least we must ask ourselves what we have gained and what we have lost by our cultural addiction to the practical and the useful. Richard Kennington and Leon Cass help us to see what lies beneath this reduction of truth to the practical, and thus show us what has been gained and what lost in the process. Commenting on the explosion of scientific knowledge and technological control so characteristic of our day, they say, quote, people generally believe that the new modern science taught us how to find the truth about nature, in the firm hope that solid knowledge would then be useful. Seek knowledge, and knowledge will give you power. But it would be more accurate to say that the new science sought first power over nature, and derivatively found a way to reconceive nature that yielded the empowering kind of knowledge. Seek power, and you will be able to devise a way of knowing that gives it to you. The result can be simply put. Knowledge permitting prediction and some control over biological events has been purchased at the cost of deep ignorance, not to say misunderstanding, of living beings, ourselves included. End quote. One need only a modicum of common sense and access to a newspaper to see that we are living within a culture obsessed with power and with the knowledge that will increase it. A culture therefore marked by an astounding ignorance of ourselves as human persons. Lost in our practical obsessions, what we have gained most is some power to manipulate nature through our astounding technology. And what we have lost most is a true understanding of the human nature that we have now so much power to mutilate. In a typically perceptive remark, Pierre Menant says that in our contemporary political situation, quote, we do not know what man is. We only know that the moral notions that govern the life in common of men are artifacts, and thus that society is not natural to man. End quote. According to Manon, we are ignorant not only of what human nature is, of what man is, we're ignorant even of how to pose the question itself of what we are. Quote, what do we really mean when we use the word man today? Whom are we speaking of when we defend human rights or engage in the human sciences? Not only do we lack a clear answer to this question, we do not even know how to go about asking it. End quote. Hidden as we are from ourselves as we practically stare at the river, how might we regain the knowledge of our nature as human persons that opens to us the possibility of love and friendship, of building true marriages and families, of pursuing virtue in rightly ordered societies, shaped by a healthy culture of human things? I suggest that any answer to this question must include a returning to the contemplative look at things. Poetry, literature, painting, the so-called fine arts, break us out of the addiction to practical mastery characteristic of our day. Literature is possible because we can also look at the river as Twain did before his days as a cub, as an apprentice. Poetry and literature remind us to stop, to turn again, and to look at the beauty of the sunset over the water, to notice once more the romance in the flush of a woman's cheek. In so doing, poetry removes the practical filter we impose on the disclosure of things. It breaks the levee of utility and allows the full intelligibility of beings to overflow. Thus, it is poetry and literature, not modern science or the mathematics and logic upon which it rests, that is penultimate to philosophy, where in philosophy we look not only at the beauty of the river in itself and as captured by the artist, we look at the being of the beautiful, and we highlight intelligibility as intelligibility, beauty as beauty, being as being. As philosophers, we're not involved directly with the Mississippi River, which is very unfortunate for me because I'm from New Orleans, and I would love to be there. But we look at the distinction between the two ways of looking at the river, and we look at the river as looked at in two different ways, all of which demands that we also look at Twain's act of distinguishing them. We note that the practical look at the water, which culminates in a certain control over it, narrows Twain's vision of the river, allowing only parts of it to come to the surface. The practical purpose of the professional looker forces him to engage in a kind of problem selecting, a filtering of the intelligibility of the thing that allows him to attend to this and to ignore that, so that he can accomplish his own aims. His practical purposes force him to cloud out the natural perfections or ends of things, thus eclipsing their beauty as it fades into his utilitarian advantage. To master it, I must impose myself onto the thing, my plans and purposes becoming central for my interaction with it, and the price of this practicality is the foregoing of the appreciation of the splendor of the thing's intelligibility, its natural beauty, or its calme. It is philosophy that can highlight the truth contained in a novel and articulate, as Aristotle says, the way in which it shows us something universally true about the human being, about nature, and about God. Our initial reflections show that the distinct modes of encountering the river map onto the myriad ways that human beings achieve the truth of things, and it highlights the intimate connection between philosophy and literature. This approach is much indebted to the philosophy of Edmund Husserl. Husserl once remarked that philosophy and poetry are related, quote, in their innermost origin and have a secret kinship of the soul, end quote. In a 1907 letter to a German poet, Husserl described an aesthetic attitude, an aesthetic stance toward reality that is intimately linked to the philosophical look at things. In a sense, talking about what Twain was saying about the way we can see things contemplatively, poetically. Roughly 7 centuries before Husserl wrote, it was none other than St. Thomas Aquinas who also reminded us that our wonder or our admiration, orandi in Latin, is that which leads us into philosophy. Quote, and since wonder was the motive which led men to philosophy, it is evident that the philosopher is, in a sense, a philomyth, a lover of fables, of stories, of myths, as is characteristic of the poets. Now, the cause that enables us to compare the philosopher to the poet is that both are concerned with the mirandum, with the wonderful, the wondrous. For the tales with which the poets deal are composed of wonders, and the philosophers themselves were moved to philosophize as a result of wonder. And since wonder stems from ignorance, they were obviously moved to philosophize in order to escape from ignorance. It is accordingly evident from this that they pursued knowledge, or diligently sought it, only for itself, and not for any utility or usefulness. Both philosophy and literature are sparked by wonder, according to St. Thomas, by admiration for the beauty of being, and both lead us to love the truth for its own sake, not merely for its utility or its usefulness. There may be an ancient quarrel between philosophers and poets, but it's a lover's quarrel, ignited by similar ways of relating to and grasping the truth of reality, both rooted in the contemplative look at things identified by Twain. Classical philosophy and its poetic allies therefore provide a powerful antidote to the modern tendency to reduce truth to that which can be won from within the practical stance, as it culminates in modern science and technology. But how is it that literature can help us to love the truth for its own sake? Is literature not, by definition, fictional? In other words, isn't literature necessarily false, or at least make-believe? A few comments from a teller of tales will be helpful. Flannery O'Connor says that, quote, "The basis of art is truth, both in matter and in mode. The person who aims after art in his work aims after truth, in an imaginative sense, no more and no less," end quote. She says that, quote, "The type of mind that can understand good fiction is not necessarily the educated mind, but it is at all times the kind of mind that is willing to have its sense of mystery deepened by contact with reality, and its sense of reality deepened by contact with mystery," end quote. She argues that the poet or novelist, if he or she is to be true to the art form, must have the aim of rendering, quote, "the highest possible justice to the visible universe." That sounds very grand, but it is really very humble. It means that the novelist must subject himself at all times to the limitations that reality imposes. But reality is not simply coextensive with the visible, end quote. A good novelist must desire to render, quote, "justice to the visible universe because it suggests an invisible one," end quote. In sum, the goal of the novelist is to portray reality in order to help readers, us readers, love the truth of that mysterious reality, the real mystery that is there to be seen if only we had eyes to see it, and to do this in an imaginative sense. But how, more specifically, can fiction present the truth of things in an imaginative sense? Aristotle argues that all art imitates nature, and that what we would call the art of literature is an imitation of action, human action. He says that imitation is natural to us as human beings. As rational animals, we are more imitative than any other animal. And in fact, he says, we, quote, "produce our first acts of understanding by means of imitation. Also, all human beings take delight in imitation," end quote. Anyone who's ever had a new baby knows this immediately. That's how they begin to speak. They start imitating the way they're spoken to. Imitation is natural to us because it enables us to experience the joy of understanding the things around us, and it does so in a social way. But imitation, mimesis, is not merely copying. To imitate is not to mimic or to represent the original in a slavish manner. Rather, to imitate, and all art imitates nature, is to grasp the intelligibility of something, to seize the truth of it, and to present that same intelligibility, to display that identical truth within a new fictional context. It is to capture the essence, the intelligibility of something, and to carry it into an imaginative setting, thus making the same essential intelligibility shine through in a new fictive place. And although the fictional setting is the creation of the artist, the truth displayed is not. The truth that enlightens classic works of art is not created, but discovered and transmitted by their artists. The great painters, poets, and novelists give us the joy, not of escaping, but of encountering reality in a deeper way when we enter into their fictional world, which is a true world insofar as it presents again the mysterious reality of which we are all a part. It helps us to wonder at what we are and at what we do, Thus, great artists give us the joy of truth in an imaginative sense, no more and no less. And they encourage us to share that truth with others, as we are attempting to do here today. This wondrous possibility is open to us as human persons because we can look at the river in the way that the young Twain did, full of awe and admiration for its wondrous beauty. Okay, second part of the talk. Just about the same time that Twain was recalling the two ways of looking at the Mississippi, Russia's greatest philosophical poet, novelist, Fyodor Dostoevsky, was working on his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. He began writing in early 1878, and it originally appeared in 16 installments in the Russian Herald from January 1879 until November of 1880, before it was published as a unified novel in 1881, the year of Dostoevsky's death. While one can point to many important themes in this modern classic, I wish to claim that the novel turns around a central point: the mystery of the human person as it is revealed in his or her relationship to God, and the social consequences of our turning to or away from God. Dostoevsky's classic is an imitation. It's a mimetic disclosure of the truth of our soul's encounter with the reality of God and with our self-knowledge that we attain in that encounter, or that we lose when we turn away from that encounter with God. As with many other themes in his work, the nature of the human person had preoccupied Dostoevsky for much of his life. In an 1839 letter to his brother, Mikhail, the teenage Dostoevsky spoke of his burgeoning love of literature and how it enabled him to make progress in learning, quote, what man and life mean, end quote. He says, quote, man is a mystery. It is necessary to divine it. If you are to be divining it, and if you are to be divining it all your life, then you can't say that you have been wasting your time. I am occupied with this mystery because I want to be a man, end quote. Near the end of his life, Dostoevsky claimed that Shakespeare was, quote, a prophet sent by God to announce to us a mystery of man, of the human soul, end quote. Dostoevsky said that his own aim was, quote, with a total realism to seek man in man. They call me a psychologist, as did Nietzsche. Untrue, Dostoevsky says. I am only a realist in the highest sense. That is, I depict all of the depths of the human soul, end quote. Robert Jackson shows that Dostoevsky's permanent artistic and philosophical consciousness can be described as a central concern with man, the view of him as an enigma, and the thought that to be a man, one must have an active interest in the human condition. This is almost a credo defining Dostoevsky's quest as an artist, end quote. Dostoevsky helps us to see that being a human person includes thinking contemplatively about what it is to be human. The contemplative grasp of truth, especially about human nature, is not a bourgeois distraction from boredom, but rather constitutive of our personhood. For being a person includes not only practical thinking, but also loving truth for its own sake, especially the truth of who we are. Further, Dostoevsky describes his method of thinking and writing. Quote, I go into the depths and, analyzing atom by atom, I seek out the whole. End quote. Any synthesis or integration of the whole comes only after distinguishing and examining the parts, or better, the unified whole emerges only once each part has been distinguished and articulated in its relation to the others. Thus, we can see the Brothers Karamazov as a contemplative, philosophical theological fiction, proceeding by way of distinction and analysis of the parts of human nature, so as to bring the whole mystery of the human person into clearer focus. Karamazov, by the way, means black smear, right? Something about condition of human nature after sin. That's what the very word means. With these points in place, what I take to be the key to the novel can now be more clearly stated. The individual members of the Karamazov family should be understood as incarnations, living, fleshly images or imitations in Aristotle's sense, of the particular parts of the human soul originally discussed by Plato. Thus, the Karamazov family drama represents, first, the struggle to unify the desires of the soul in the pursuit of truth, and second, the social consequences of succeeding or failing to achieve this unity. By structuring the novel around the mystery of the human person, Dostoevsky gives a Christian recapitulation of the deepest themes in Plato's Gorgias, where Socrates and his triad of interlocutors similarly present the dimensions of human nature and show the individual and social drama inherent in the education of the soul's eros. The Karamazov family shows us what the Platonic insight concerning the human unity of the human soul looks like once it is embedded within the Christian understanding of the human person's participation in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The fruit of Dostoevsky's turn to the contemplative life therefore helps us to raise once again the question of what it means to be a person, and it puts us on a path to entering more deeply into the mystery of who, not what, we are. Since Dostoevsky's presentation of the human person in the Brothers Karamazov stands firmly in the Platonic Christian tradition, both in terms of content and method, let us move to a brief discussion of Plato's Gorgias and the way it presents the parts of the human soul. Now, of course, any student of philosophy, and even well beyond that, knows Plato isn't famous for many things, but one of the things he's famous for is his understanding of the tripartite theory of the human soul. But it's important to have the proper understanding of what we mean by part when discussing a Platonic understanding of the parts of the human soul. When using part in this philosophical sense, we should not think so much of fragments of a larger whole, like pieces of a puzzle, but rather as kinds of person you might become, should you identify yourself chiefly with a specific aspect of human nature, and thus allow the good perfective of that dimension of your being to become primary and normative in your life. The parts of the soul are dimensions of human nature with which you can identify yourself, and precisely by doing so, give yourself a basic orientation toward reality and social life. The parts of the soul allow us to form certain kinds of self-understanding, each of which carries its own mode of thinking and living, and thus each has its own teleology toward a certain way of life with others. We recall Plato's tripartite theory of the soul. The human soul exhibits itself in nous, or intellect, thumos, spirit, or anger, grittiness, or toughness, and orexis, or sensual appetite. Each ordered to its own object, each open to its own specific virtue, and all needing to be harmonized by channeling one's eros properly. This understanding of the parts of the soul is depicted most famously in the image of the soul as charioteer, to which I will return at the end. Appetite is ordered towards sensual pleasure. Thumos, or anger, is ordered toward protecting the good as disclosed by intellect, and toward the honor associated with such protection. And nous is ordered toward the truth of reality, the truth of being. Eros is not itself a part of the soul, according to Plato, but rather that most mysterious and powerful desire for beauty in all of its manifestations. Eros is both natural and open to reason's direction, such that our eros unifies or fractures the soul as it is filtered through the three parts towards the natural objects of those parts. Because of this inextricable link between the parts of the soul and the soul's eros, that is, because the soul is erotic in its parts, because eros expresses itself through each part of the soul's eros must be understood along the same lines of what we mean by the soul's parts. The eros of the soul flowing through its parts is like a movement toward moral destinations, where we will find ourselves being a certain kind of person. In other words, you will become like what you love. An excellent comment made by Zena Hitz helps us to capture this link between the soul's eros and its parts. Quote, "We tend to think of the objects of our desires as items in a restaurant buffet, perhaps some of this, perhaps some of that. But our desires and their objects are more like rivers. They have a force and pressure all their own. Once we set out on them, they pull us along in a particular direction. opening up possibilities to us that we did not expect or choose. This simple psychological fact is the reason why there is such a thing as education, which requires not only discipline and social incentives, but also the guidance of wise elders who know what lies along certain pathways. End quote. In the Gorgias, Plato presents the parts of the soul and its eros by showing Socrates in 3 consecutive conversations with 3 different interlocutors: Gorgias, the eponymous character, Polus, and Callicles. These conversations become increasingly heated and acrimonious. By the final conversation, we have Socrates calling Callicles a catamite, and Callicles all but threatening Socrates' life and family. In order to understand each interlocutor, we have to ask a tripartite question. What does he identify himself with? What does he love? That is, what is he erotic for? What kind of man is he? These are 3 complementary forms of one and the same question. For his part, Gorgias is a sophist and rage whore. He is presented as a man who lives by the mind, by logos, and there are some signs that he is, or at least wants to be, a decent man. However, he devotes his intelligence to rhetorical displays that awe and persuade, but do not reveal the truth of things. His logoi do not uncover reality so much as enable aspiring young Athenian men to control others. His is a life of the mind devoted to the practical navigation of the choppy waters of ancient democratic political life. That is, he's a sophist, what we would call an ideologue today, and thus he is unerotic for truth. He is a snapshot of nous, but nous divorced from the eros for being, for wisdom and philosophy. He loves himself and his intellectual skill, and those shallow loves serve to arm the tyrants of the city. His self-serving sophistry opens the door to the city's destruction. For his part, Polus is a younger and more aggressive man. His very name means something like young bolt, or colt, or longhorn, actually, might even be something we could sort of stretch. And we are told that he roars into the conversation once it hits a snag with Gorgias. He is obsessed with coercive power, with the violence of tyranny, with the honor of victory and the shame of defeat within political life. He is less intellectually sophisticated than his predecessor in the conversation. His arguments, in fact, are somewhat ridiculous. He is thumos, anger incarnate. For his part, Callicles discloses the irrationality and feverish intensity of the desire for sensual pleasure once it is unmoored from truth. Callicles argues that the best life is one in which we constantly enlarge our appetite for pleasure and then increase our power and control over others so as to satisfy incessantly our ever-expanding sensual desires. Along the way, he claims that the real natural law is that the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. He is so tyrannical and unerotic for truth that he forces Socrates to finish the conversation by himself. He is the thinkable look of the appetitive desire for pleasure once it comes to dominate the life of a man, and he shows the social destruction that follows in his wake. By contrast, Socrates shows us the unified whole of human nature. He's a living image of nous in love with the truth of being and the philosophical life that flows from and leads to it. He is therefore an image of the unity of the human soul achieved in one's erotic desires devoted primarily to wisdom and is disciplined consistently by philosophical conversation. Socrates' eros for philosophy enables him to see truth, the object of his love, as that for the sake of which he speaks and acts. He sees that truth is a common good because it is not lessened when shared with others. His love of philosophy, his eros for truth, engenders a harmony in his soul and therefore a stability in his life. This stability is revealed by the fact that Socrates cannot cease proclaiming the thesis that doing injustice is always worse than suffering it. And he can't stop saying this because his beloved philosophy always says this to him. James Shaw refers to this Socratic thesis in its offshoot, that it is better to be killed unjustly than to do injustice yourself, as the fundamental principle of civilization. Socrates says that it is better to die than to do evil. When all else fails, this is the basic civilizational standard. Civilization is held up by those, often too few, who refuse to do evil, end quote. Socrates' love of truth shows us the truth of human nature and thus provides the only sound, solid foundation for real civilization. Finally, we should add that the three conversations structuring the dialogue are not merely private contests between Socrates and his interlocutors. Plato indicates that a crowd is eagerly listening and therefore that the soul of Athens is at stake in their conversation. Socrates is engaged in a battle for who will disclose the natural foundations of a healthy social and political life, a battle ever ancient and ever new. Thus, the dialogue shows that the battle for society is a battle over competing answers to the question, what is the human person? Let us spin the reel forward approximately 2,200 years and move further to the east. Our discussion of the Karamazov family begins with the question raised by the prosecutor near the end of the novel. What, after all, is this Karamazov family? I suggest this question can be understood as the novel's way of asking, what, after all, is this human person? We recall the members, or the individual parts, of the family. Fyodor, the murdered father. Dmitri, the eldest son accused of parricide. Ivan, the middle child, and Alexei, the youngest. There have been various attempts to interpret the significance of the members of this family, especially the three brothers. Some identify Dmitri with the body, Ivan with the mind, and Alexei with the soul. Others argue that each represents one of the aspects of a theocracy, priests, Alexei, warrior kings, Dmitri, and prophets, Ivan. However, I think it more faithful to the text and richer intellectually to see Fyodor as an image of appetite, Dmitri as an image of thumos, Ivan as an image of nous, in love not with truth but only with himself, and Alexei as the incarnation of the Christian understanding of the human heart. Thus, within the family, we see the last will be first and the first will be last. The parts of the soul, that is, the kinds of person you might become should you identify yourself with a specific potential of human nature, and thereby take the good of that potential as normative for your choices, are displayed by the members of the Karamazov family. But they are displayed insofar as they are taken up into the Christian understanding of the human person that is revealed by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. In the light of Christ, which illuminates Dostoevsky's work, we can see that the Platonic insight that the soul's natural eros for truth and for the divine beauty is in fact a natural desire to worship the one true God. Because we are rational and made to the image of God, our hearts are naturally oriented to worship Him in whose image we are created. The question, and this is one of the questions that the novel really forces you to think about, the question is not if, but rather what we will worship. For we are worshiping beings who will find something to worship. And that question is the question of our lives. For we will become like what we worship, and our social lives and culture will bear the marks of our worship. For his part, Fyodor is described as a sensualist and as a senseless buffoon. He swindles his way to wealth only to dissipate himself with it as a means to satisfying his bodily desires for pleasure. He is as depraved as he is profligate, and his debauchery leads him not only to neglect, but to completely forget about the very existence of his son Dmitri. The ripples of his mindless hedonism and subsequent destruction of his family are felt throughout the town. He is a picture of unbridled appetite and of the human social suffering that the unbounded pursuit of pleasure causes. He worships pleasure, and in so doing, he destroys himself, his family, and his society. For his part, Dmitri is a physically powerful, angry, and violent soldier, prone to outbursts of destructive aggression. He throws himself into wild episodes of drunkenness, sexual license, and violence, but more as an outlet for his passionate energy, and less because of some slavery to those pleasures. Yet, he has an acute sensitivity to and profound respect for the honor attendant upon noble actions and character. He somehow knows in his bones that noblesse oblige, and he is absolutely devoted to the truth insofar as he can grasp it, although he's not very sophisticated intellectually. Importantly, he is the son of Theodore and his first wife, Adelaida, who is described as displaying nobility of character despite being, quote, a hot-tempered, bold, dark-browed, impatient woman possessed of remarkable physical strength. That's the description of Dimitri's mother. In their vicious fights, it was Adelaida who beat her revolting and senseless husband Theodore before running off with the destitute seminarian. Dimitri is a depiction of thumos, of the struggle to enlist its ferocity in service of reason's grasp of truth, and of the social destruction that ensues when it fights on the side of the appetitive rather than on the side of the truly good. He tends to worship Grushenka. In fact, he says that multiple times, who is the seductive young woman loved both by Dimitri and his father, and who is the object over which they fight. In his dream sequence, his worship of Grushenka seems to soften his anger and to open to him the possibility of caring for the Russian peasants, even though he doesn't understand his dream. His love points him beyond himself, and thus there is in Dimitri something like an opening to God in his heart. For his part, Ivan is the brilliant intellectual and precocious university student. He is described as a thinker and a philosopher, but one who squanders his genius playing intellectual games and making arguments he himself doesn't truly believe. Zosimus sees right through his arguments and says, even you don't believe your own arguments. He loves and worships only himself. His famous poem, The Grand Inquisitor, is less an honest philosophical objection to the existence of God and more a lawyerly justification for a decision his heart has already made to reject God, to return to God the ticket he offers us. As Ivan himself says, quote, I made up my mind long ago not to understand, end quote. His claim that God does not exist and therefore that all things are permitted merely obscures and attempts to validate the prior refusal of his heart to worship anything other than himself. This sophistry opens the gates to Smerniakov's murder of his father. Ivan's worship of himself strikes at the very foundations of social life. He's a sophist that opens the door to murder. In his dream, he argues with the devil. That is, he argues with himself in his dream. Even in his dreams, he cannot go beyond the limits of his own narrow mind. Near the end of the novel, he fittingly suffers from an attack of brain fever, which we may hope is the beginning of his own conversion. He is Gorgias Redivivus, a living image of Nous enslaved to a dishonest heart and the social perversions that revolt from the falsehood he generates and indeed celebrates. By contrast, Alexei, our hero, as Dostoevsky calls him, shows us the mystery of the whole human person, unified in love of God and neighbor. In the introductory note from the author, we are told that Alexei may seem eccentric, but that, quote, an eccentric is not always a particularity in a separate element, but on the contrary, he is the person who carries within himself the very heart of the whole. And the rest of the men of his epoch have for some reason been temporarily torn from it, as if by flood. Alexei is an icon of the human heart as revealed by Christ, the human heart inflamed with love of its creator and redeemer. He shows what the mystery of human eros looks like once it is engulfed by grace and taken up into the worship of God in spirit and truth. Thus, he discloses the proper unity of the soul that can be achieved only when the heart is in love with God and one's neighbor in view of God. Alexei worships Jesus Christ. And although gifted with a natural piety, the icon of Alexei had to be written throughout the novel. His immature intellect was shocked by the stench of the decaying dead body of his beloved elder Zosima. He admits to being a sensualist like his father and had to integrate his burgeoning sexual desire that had been aroused by Grushenka. And his own puerile anger at the injustice of the world was fortified by confronting Ivan's ravings. Importantly, both Alexei and Ivan are the sons of Fyodor and his second wife, Sophia. But unlike Ivan, Alexei's life is shaped by a memory he carries of his sobbing mother hugging him while she prays in front of an icon of Our Lady, illuminated by the sunlight pouring in through the window. His dream is actually a kind of mystical experience in which his love of the elder is extended to a passionate love for all of reality. In his dream, in his mystical experience, he is united to God and to all reality in ecstatic love, which he must then bring out of the monastery and into the world. That's the job given to him by the elder. In our discussion of Plato, we briefly mentioned his famous image of the soul as charioteer to disclose the parts of the human soul. The driver, Nous, attempts to lead two horses, the white horse, who is Thumos, which listens to the command of its master and pulls onward and upward, and the black horse, Appetite, who constantly fights both the driver and the white horse to bring the whole thing down. In Dostoevsky, we have the soul depicted not by a charioteer with two horses, but by a troika. As the lawyer says, quote, "Our fatal troika dashes on in her headlong flight, perhaps to destruction, and in all Russia for long past men have stretched out imploring hands and called a halt to its furious, reckless course." End quote. In the light of Christ, we can see three horses. For Alexei shows us that nous is indeed rooted in something deeper. The intellect is rooted in something deeper, namely the human heart. The heart, the core of the human person where we turn toward or away from Christ, is now in the driver's seat for Dostoevsky. And the three horses now represent intellect, spiritedness or anger, and our desire for pleasure. Because Alexei is the icon of the human person whose passionate love is taken up into the right worship of God, he becomes the basis for a healthy culture and social life founded on the truth of the human person and the friendship it makes possible. That is the deepest significance of the claim that the Troika will save or destroy Russia. And it shows the real meaning of the novel's final scene. At the close of the novel, Alexei acts in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, for the 12 young Russian boys who are mourning the death of their little friend. Alexei brings the love and structure of Christ's Last Supper into the city, into the youth. And in response to his sermon, the young boys, the new apostles, cry out, "Hurrah, Karamazov." That is, hurrah to men and women created to the image and likeness of God. Hurrah to the God-man who redeemed them on the cross. A culture founded upon that exclamation is a healthy one. Alexei is the person at the heart of the novel, and therefore he shows us that the human person is at the heart of the novel. He does so because he incarnates the truth of the human heart as revealed by Christ. But we should not see the centrality of the heart as an option for a quasi-Franciscan priority of will over intellect. Rather, it's an identification of and with that deepest core of the human person revealed by Christ, the common spring of both intellect and will, the soil from which both intellect and will grow, and at which they are still fully intertwined. The heart is the original opening of the soul to the light. That's its intellectual function. The heart is also the primordial ability to turn toward or away from the light. That's volitional. The heart is the basis of our mode of life with God and others. Alexei's icon of the heart shows that the reality of eros is not repressed by Christianity, but is rather taken up into the question of what we will worship. He shows that our hearts are created for worship, and worship in common with others. So the question we must face is not whether, but what we will love, what we will lovingly worship, and thus what kind of culture will we help create in our wake. Now, brief conclusion. I want just very quickly to point out the similarity between Dostoevsky's classic and the teaching of Pope St. John Paul II. John Paul II couldn't write or say anything without this quotation. Quote, "For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord. Christ, the new Adam, in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high call." End quote. JP2 says that God has entrusted the visible world to us as a gift and a task. And he adds that God, quote, has assigned us a particular mission to accomplish the truth about ourselves and about the world. We must be guided by the truth about ourselves so as to be able to structure the visible world according to truth, correctly using it to serve our purposes without abusing it. In other words, this twofold truth about the world and about ourselves provides the basis for every intervention by us upon creation. End quote. I'll end with this. Some of you may know that Dostoevsky originally planned The Brothers Karamazov to be in 2 volumes. Right? So what we have as The Brothers Karamazov was to be the first part, and then there was to be a second novel that he, unfortunately, was never able to write. So we didn't get the sequel from Dostoevsky, but perhaps we got one in the life and teaching of Pope St. John Paul II. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I'm speechless this time, so.
Thank you for this early talk. I wanted to ask about how we understand human nature. So human nature is often identified or mystified, so it's this object of investigation. But it occurs to me that in doing so, we often place a distance between an original primordial human nature and technological augmentation that comes afterwards.
Could you say that part?
A primordial human nature that precedes human intervention and the technological augmentation that comes afterwards in human civilization. And I would like to argue that technology is not something that merely arises in the course of human civilization, but rather is something that we can know transcendentally according to the geometrical dynamics of machines in motion. This is something that's been demonstrated by modern kinematics, which allows for accurate description of machines. So if technology is something transcendental, then it's something that has always been a part of human nature. This is what Bernard Stiegler calls ethno-phylogenesis, that is the co-constitutiveness of human nature by technology. So if that's the case, then how can we, as it were, deny this sort of technological development that coincides with and cooperates with human nature as it variously develops across time and space?
Yeah, very good question. I hope that what I said did not imply that I think we need to deny that or that we should stop what you're describing. I hope it didn't come off that way, because that's not at all what I think. That's not what Twain thought. I mean, if you know anything about Twain, he was certainly not someone who was opposed to technological advances, right? Quite the opposite. Rather, what I'm saying that we do need to identify and avoid is the very, very deep mistake, which is very unnatural, which is the use of technology to create ourselves, right? And that's something which follows upon sin. So you're quite right that it's an aspect of human nature for us to tend the garden and to develop tools that help us tend the garden, right? So we are workers by nature, and to work well, we're also creators by nature, right? The problem is that once the heart has turned in the wrong direction, technology now is no longer understood as something which is meant to facilitate natural flourishing, but rather something which is our tool to create ourselves in our own image, whatever that image happens to be. And this is really, really clear in medicine, right? So instead of advancing technology which helps nature to recover itself or to pursue the ends natural to human beings, obviously if we just look around, medicine is being used for all kinds of mutilation of nature, right? So that's the issue. It's not technology as such, rather it's the abuse of technology, which I think lies, and I think the novel is telling us, it lies at sort of somewhere in the core of the human person, namely the human heart. Right? If the heart is turned in the right way, then technology will help us flourish as human beings, and it will be seen as subservient to human nature. In other words, human nature will be normative for our creation and use of technology. Amen to that, right? The problem is obviously the other way. And obviously, I mean, Descartes is in the background. I mentioned Descartes once, but of course, Descartes says what? Get rid of contemplative thinking, right? There should be no contemplative philosophy. It's useless. He's right, it is useless. That's why it's so important. Get rid of contemplative thinking. We need practical thinking. Why do we need practical thinking? To develop medicine and technology. And why do we need to develop medicine and technology? To make ourselves masters and possessors of nature, right? That's almost a summary of a lot of the modern degradation that we see, right? And that's the mistake, right? So he cuts off the contemplative so that we can create ourselves based upon our own technologies. That's the mistake, not technology as such.
Because we are an institute that talks about family and marriage, the question is related to the female characters of the novel. And whether, I mean, if you want to talk about it, but like whether this platonic framework to understand the brothers could be used to understand the women, just the same, or whether Dostoevsky has something to say about what is, how and which way the man-female relationship can lead to a success, to a flourishing.
Yeah, good. I certainly think both Plato and Dostoevsky would say that the parts of the soul apply to men and women fully, right? So the dimensions of human nature are the same. Of course, you might say they're calibrated in slightly different ways, right? Thumos is more of a destructive possibility for men than for women generally, right? In the novel, I think the women are presented as the two mothers are very important, right? Because they are kind of Genesis stories, obviously, as mothers. But by being sort of part of the Genesis story, they show who their children are, right? So Dimitri's mother, of course, is more Thumaic, and therefore he is kind of in her image. And Sophia, wisdom, her two children are Ivan and Alexei, who both live more by the mind, more intellectually sophisticated. And I think it's certainly not accidental that the drama is a family drama, right? In other words, I think what Dostoevsky is saying is that this drama, yeah, it starts in terms of the level of the human heart and parts of the soul, whether or not they're unified. But the first place where those parts of the soul are going to be understood and either unified or fractured is the family, right? And the first casualty, if I can say it that way, from the father is the women in his life, right? In other words, the first person that he destroys other than himself is his wife, his two wives, right? And I think that's the role they play in the family. That's the role they play in the novel. I mean, they're the givers of life. Now, you could also talk about Grushenko and Katya and sort of what they represent in the novel. And I think, again, the parts of the soul apply to all human beings, men and women. The family drama, though, comes out in terms of the way that the boys, the way the sons, and the way the father, if they're unified, then they can relate properly to the women in their lives. And when they're not, the first people who suffer other than themselves are the women that they're trying to love. And that's what I can say for them. That's what I think for the novel.
So you talked about the different ways of orientation of the heart are represented in these characters. How do you see that relating to Smerdyakov?
Good, yeah.
Because he's always been one of the hardest characters for me to understand, and I think I found it when I learned that Dostoevsky had seizures himself, and then his character had. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm happy because there's a long. It was already too long, but there's a longer version of this in which I go into Smerdyakov, and I think it's very clear in the novel. This is a bit of a spoiler, if you haven't already read it. What does he represent? Because he is a son of Fyodor, right? The wages of sin is death. The wage of sin is death. So remember, Smerdyakov is the child of rape, right? So Fyodor, in a complete drunken stupor, rapes the young woman, stinking Lizaveta, who is really a picture of holy innocence, right? So it's one of the worst possible crimes you can imagine. So remember stinking Lizaveta, so she's what we would call mentally disabled, mentally handicapped. She's kind of known to be a holy woman in her own right, but she refuses to sleep anywhere other than outside. And he sees her when he's completely drunk, and his friends dare him basically to rape her, and he does. And when he rapes her, Smerdyakov is the child that she has by him, and of course she dies giving birth to him. That is as gross an image of sin as you can give, right? One of the grossest images of sin, and what happens? What are the wages of sin? Death. It's Smerdyakov who kills Fyodor, right? So, in other words, I think he's an incarnation of that, right? And it's a brilliant. It's actually very difficult to sort of encounter it and really think about it. but it's a brilliant incarnation of the relationship between sin and death. And notice the result of sin is death for the sinner, first and foremost, right? So that's how I think he fits in, right? Yeah. When everything goes wrong, what does that look like? Yeah.
I have a question on the nature of Grushenka and Dimitri's their convergence. Alyosha being kind of acting as the foil for all of the characters. When they encounter him, but their complete spaces, their depravity and sickness. I just wanted to hear if you had any more thoughts on their own convergence. The first time Alyosha goes to Grushenka's house, has this outburst, but you're not sure on the validity of it. But then once they're faced with imprisonment and these sentences, then it seems more legitimate.
It's a very good question, and also kind of part of the longer presentation. JP2's point that it's our encounter with God, specifically as God incarnate in Christ, that reveals us to ourselves. We gain a true, deeper sense of ourselves. We gain a deeper self-knowledge precisely in encountering Christ, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. So when we come to know the original, we know ourselves as images better, right? Now, that's a very important theological principle. That gets incarnated, you might say, in Alexei, because he comes to know and love God so deeply, and now his soul is unified, that he becomes another Christ for them. He becomes sort of a beacon of Christ's life for everyone else. So you notice when everyone else in the dialogue comes into contact with Alexei, what happens? They actually get better in some sense. Even the father, Fyodor, kind of behaves when he's around Alexei, and everyone loves him. He stresses that in the novel. Everyone loves him. So the more they encounter him, the more they begin to understand something about themselves, right? And as they begin to understand something more deeply by encountering Alexei, because they see something about the unified person in Alexei. And so as they encounter him more deeply, they come to know something about themselves more deeply, which opens up the possibility for them to move closer towards truth, to move closer towards living out a beautiful, noble human life. And all of the characters, and that's, in a sense, that's part of the mission that Alexei has now. He has to bring the love of Christ into the city, but that includes helping people to understand the truth about themselves insofar as they encounter him. And then there's a deeper philosophical point here too, or there's another philosophical point here too, which is that if you really want to know something, you got to look at the good example. I mean, every teacher who's ever taught, or every parent who's ever had a child knows, if I want to teach my child something, I got to give them a good example, not a bad example. If you want to know how to hit in baseball, you don't go watch a 5-year-old who can barely pick up a bat. You want to learn how to hit in baseball, you go watch a great hitter. Here's what the perfect thing looks like, and you start to know yourself in relationship to that paradigm, right? And that's what Alexei is. He's the fullness of the human person. And by encountering him, people come to know themselves deeply. And therefore, not only do they know themselves more deeply in terms of their nature, they start to see their shortcomings as well. And he's the perfect image of human nature in some sense because he loves God. His eros is properly oriented. So as you see him encounter other people, you see this kind of this growth, both in their self-knowledge and their love throughout the novel. They don't always understand, like Dmitri can't articulate any of it. And that's why there's a battle, especially when Dmitri's in jail. There's a kind of a battle between what Ivan tells him and what some of the other people are telling him. They give him a kind of materialist view of the human person. Remember this conversation where Dmitri's trying to talk about the things going on in his brain and he can't really describe it well? What's going on there? Two different competing conceptions of what it means to be human. He's getting this materialist reductionist view from other people, but then he encounters the truth in Alexei, right? So I think that's a big part of the novel. Yeah, that's a very good question. I hope does that answer the question? Okay.
So I have a question about Ivan's role as the artist, especially in regards to the first part of your lecture, which I'm more concerned with the idea of literature being a vessel of truth. And so Ivan, he's the poet of the brothers, if you will. He's the one who, I'm assuming he wrote the most as a student, as a scholar. Sure. So could you maybe connect the dots between his form of imitation compared to one that has truth vested?
Yeah, you go back to those quotes from Flannery O'Connor, where she says, the real job of the artist is to help you see reality And the only way the artist can do that is if the artist submits himself or herself to the limitations imposed by reality. And in that, so I was quoting from an essay called The Nature and Aim of Fiction, which is a brilliant essay, right? A brilliant essay. It was a talk that she used to give to people in creative writing programs, I think at University of Iowa. In that essay, she also talks about this, that if you're going to be a real artist, you have to submit yourself to reality. In other words, you have to be contemplative. You can't impose yourself on reality. That's the first way of looking at it, or the second way of looking at it, right? You have to allow the structures of reality to disclose themselves to you, which in some sense means you put yourself underneath them and look up to them, as it were, right? And that's the precondition for creating good art, according to her, right? Once I see the structures of something, once I see the intelligibility of love, of hatred, of anger, of friendship, of revenge, whatever it is, right? Then I can begin to imitate it in an imaginative sense. And then my literature can not only be sort of pleasing, but true. That's exactly what Ivan won't do as a man. He simply won't submit himself to the structures of reality. He won't submit himself to the structures, or let's say to any kind of subservience to God, right? He has to put himself forward as the only thing that matters, right? He's made himself into his own God, in other words, right? So he's brilliant, right? He's brilliant, and no one doubts that. But because he won't allow reality to disclose itself, then his art is sophistry, sophistical art, which means it's not art, it's propaganda, right? He's a sophist. And this is one of the big things, I mean, you know, not to get, obviously it's a perennial issue. A lot of what people call art now is not art at all. It's artful propaganda. For left wing or right wing, at that point I don't care, it's just boring, I don't want to. Real art has to be something which is after truth, which therefore has to in Joseph Pieper's phrase, all art has to really transcend the workaday world, right? It has to transcend any kind of practical desires on the part of the artist. So Ivan is artistic and he's brilliant, but he creates sophistical arguments at the end. And they're moving, right? But he's kind of cut himself off, you might say, from the wellspring of true art. So to put it in relationship to Gorgias, because he is kind of a renewed image of Gorgias. Gorgias' sophistry is very powerful because it's persuasive. Ivan's version of that in his art is very powerful because it's somehow enthralling, right? But it's sophistical. Yeah.
During your talk, you said that the question is not what we are, but who we are.
Yeah.
Does it come back to what you just said about seeing ourselves through the good examples, or is there another meaning behind what you meant by the who rather than what?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think the good example is part of it, but I'm really drawing on something from a really wonderful 20th century German Catholic philosopher, Robert Schwemann, who has a book called Human Persons, Someone, Not Something. Right? And he makes the very simple but very profound point that as human persons, we are not something. Right? You can talk about anything else as a thing, from the desk to the tree. I would even maybe hesitate in terms of animals, but okay, you can call a dog a thing in some sense, right? Although even that's somewhat misleading. But one thing you can't call a thing, because it's not a thing, is a person. Right? Because we're not something, we're someone. The dignity of being a human person means that we have, I guess, that kind of infinite dignity, right? And therefore, our language betrays a kind of misunderstanding when we talk about persons as things, right? And so when I was pointing to that, I was, to know ourselves, to know who, not what we are, because in a sense, we're not a what, we're a who. Right? Horton here's a who. You know this, right? I have a lot of kids. I have 7 kids, so Dr. Seuss is an ever present in my home. Anyway, is that?
That helps. Thank you. Yeah.
And we have to be this is just a more general point. We have to really be careful with how we speak in general. Words are so powerful because words have their own nature, right? And the nature of words that we cannot create, but that we can employ properly, is to disclose reality. And so when we call a person a thing, we're in fact not disclosing the reality that's there to be understood. And as soon as you start using those words, now all of a sudden you can begin justifying doing really horrible things towards another thing. But if you're really careful, and you're really trying to always make sure that your words disclose reality properly, and you always call a person, not something, but someone, already I begin to sort of feel the pull of what I would say is the natural law there, to treat that person not as a thing, but rather as someone. And you have to be careful with euphemisms, because, I mean, in a sense, it gets back to the issue of sophistry, right? Because the sophist tries to cover reality instead of disclosing it, right?
Okay, I think that's a little bit of like, it feels like that's the point of the novel as well, how there's the 3-hour words. Like Alexi writes everything down that the elder says.
Yeah.
And everyone's like writing everything down and saying it. I think there's a lot in the novel of the power of how we talk.
That's,
back to what you just said.
I think any serious thinker, everyone from Confucius to Plato to Dostoevsky to Walker Percy, 1984, I mean, every serious thinker understands this issue of what language is and how it can be abused. Joseph Pieper has this wonderful, wonderful essay, Use and Abuse of Language. Perfect statement of this issue. Walker Percy has this great line, I can't remember which novel they were asking him about, and he said, I just wanted, maybe it was the movie goer, I can't remember. He said, I just wanted to call things by their right names. That's it. And when he did so, people were shocked. They kind of like, what is he doing? I'm just calling things by their right names, right? And again, just open the newspaper, take any hotly disputed issue, and you're going to see this attempt on both sides in some way to hide the reality in front of them by using sophistical language. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have one more?
Professor, earlier in response to another question you asked, or this gentleman who left asked, you said that it's a sin to use technology to upgrade ourselves. Is that correct? And if so, can you explain why?
I don't know if I said sin, but the attempt to be our own God is in some way, the original sin. And it's original in really not just the sense of the first temporally, original in the sense that it's kind of at the heart of every sin. In other words, at the heart of every sin is somehow, whether it's sort of consciously worked out or not, an attempt to put myself above God and above God's law and above God's love. In other words, to be my own creator, to be the one that will decide who I am, and to be the one that will decide how I should live based on who I am, right? So the original sin, in some sense, in this sense, the original sense of perennial, foundational, is in some way, or at least has the trace of this desire to make ourselves into our own God. Nietzsche thought that's exactly what we should be doing. That's what we should do, right? That's at the heart of every sin, I would say. Technology becomes enlisted in that in a very intense way, because as soon as you take the first step towards trying to really create yourself, well, how are you going to do it? Well, you need something to help you do it. And, well, technology, there it is. It's one of the first things we use to try to create ourselves, right? So that's not of the nature of technology. That's not of the essence of technology. Technology it's a tool. It's a kind of a know-how that expresses itself in creating things that help us to achieve whatever our purposes are. If those purposes are good, then the use and the creation of that technology is good, right? In and of itself, it's somewhat neutral, right? But it's right there. It's the first thing that we reach for, one of the first things that we reach for once we go down this path of self-creation, right? I mean, how are you going to make yourself immortal? If you're going to try, your soul is already immortal by nature, right? But if I'm going to make myself immortal, I teach philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and my building is called the University Hall on campus. It was the old Howard Hughes, it was like a big warehouse for Howard Hughes, right? I don't know if you know part of the story, but I mean, how do you try to make yourself immortal? Well, you have to use technology to try to freeze or whatever it is, right? This kind of transhumanism. Okay, what's the first thing they try to use to make themselves more than human? Well, they got to do it through technology, and that's just a fact, right? So the point of the deep problem is not with the technology, right? The deep problem is with the sin at the level of the human heart. I don't know if I'm answering exactly your question.
Yeah, it was a two-part question, and I mean it's a big question, something you can discuss for a long time.
Yeah.
I guess you definitely answered the first part. The second part might not be answerable in the time we have, but like, what is the creation of man? Like, how could technology create man?
We can't. We wanted to. Just like we want to be God, but we can't be. We can be like God. In fact, we already are by nature like God. But we can be like God by accepting Christ ultimately, but also by developing moral virtues and these things. But we can't be God, but we want to try. And the more we try, the more we destroy ourselves, right? Just like technology can't make us God, but we can try to use it for that end. And when we do, we destroy both the technology and ourselves in the process. This is my reading of Oedipus. I mean, what does it mean? Now, that's not biblical, obviously, right? But what does it mean to murder your father and marry your mother? Maybe it's an image of trying to generate yourself, right? To create yourself. And what happens when you realize that you've been trying to generate yourself? If you have any decency, you should just tear your eyes out. That's a pagan view of it. That's not a biblical view, right? Because the biblical view is once you realize you've been trying to be your own God, you should repent and believe the gospel, right? There's hope in the Christian version of that story. So I think it's a self-defeating enterprise for sure, right? By the way, I think this is I gave a talk recently, or I don't know when, I think it was a few years ago now, I don't know, but on artificial intelligence. And the first part was a kind of a philosophical understanding of, well, just what is this? And my argument is that it's really not intelligence at all. But the second part was, why do we seem obsessed as a culture with making it to be intelligence? Why? You could probably figure out what my answer is. If we made it intelligence, we've created something in our own image and likeness. In other words, we've made ourselves God. Right? Anyway.
I will give the opportunity for the very, very last question.
I was thinking about how you began with mentioning purchasing power by ignorance dynamic or having separate Cartesian consequences in society, compared to Aloysius' crescendo, the vertical arrows towards God that gives people knowledge of themselves. And so inverse dynamic of purchasing knowledge by ignorance by giving people knowledge of themselves by love of God.
Exactly. You've understood the talk well. It's well said, in fact. You should have written the blurb. That would have been a better blurb for the talk. I don't know that I have much to add other than to say, to be careful. I mean, the first question was about kind of touching on us a little bit. That doesn't mean that it's bad to have practical knowledge of how to navigate the river. It's in fact good. But Twain's brilliant because he says, but you have to know that you lose something when you look at the river that way. And the problem is that we're ignorant. Let me put it this: we're blind to our own ignorance. Right? That's Renon's point. We don't even know how to ask the question of what is a human person. And so the practical limits, it gives us a hyper competency in that limited area. But we have to consistently remind ourselves there's another way of looking at the river. And that way of looking at the river will give us a fullness of a knowledge of human nature, of God, of friendship, family life, social life. And we have to be drawn back to that constantly. And that's what literature can do, that's what philosophy can do, and that's obviously what theology can do. Right? So I agree.
All right. So, I just wanted to let you all know that if you're interested in what Professor Roniger has to say, you have another chance to hear him speak. It's going to be tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. in Garrison Hall. You can go on our website to see exactly the class, but the classroom is I can't remember here now. Is at 5:30? There's going to be a panel discussion between Professor Roniger, Professor Budziszewski, who's a professor at UT in philosophy, and they're both going to discuss the consequences of doing wrong, right? So the natural, is their natural law of consequence. And they're both gonna tackle the issue from their perspective, so I invite you all to come. And thank you again to the Science Center for hosting us. I'm sorry, thank you.